Imagine facing an enemy who could vanish at will, lure you out of your strongest fortress, and destroy an entire army in a single morning. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer territory. He rewrote the rules of war with 3 tactical moves so lethal that generals still debate their secrets today. How did his outnumbered cavalry annihilate foes protected by mountains or rivers? The answers begin in a narrow Chinese pass, where the first lesson in Mongol deception would change military history forever. High ridges and broken slopes carved the landscape north of the Jin capital, forming a tangled barrier of stone and earth. The Great Wall here was not a single, unbroken line, but a patchwork of fortresses and mountain passes, each one a possible entry, each one a trap for the unwary. At Wusha Fortress, the defenses looked solid, but Genghis Khan's scouts moved like shadows, riding for days along the frontier, mapping every fold and hollow. Their reports revealed what the Jin commanders missed. The sector near Yehuling, and especially the passage called Badger Mouth, was less crowded with defenders than the heavily manned gates to the east. The pass itself twisted through steep, narrow valleys, where visibility dropped to almost nothing. On either side, rocky ridges blocked any chance of seeing what moved beyond the next bend. For the Jin, this meant safety. For the Mongols, it was an invitation. Genghis understood that in these mountains, numbers counted for less than control of the ground. A large army could barely deploy, let alone coordinate. Messages between Jin units bogged down in the maze of gullies and ravines. Each outpost watched its own approach, blind to what happened just over the next ridge. Reconnaissance teams worked methodically, riding close to enemy lines at night, counting watchfires, listening for the clatter of supply wagons. They marked the rhythms of the Jin guards, the gaps between patrols, and the places where the wall's stones gave way to raw hillside. Every detail mattered. Genghis's commanders, like Macaulay, studied the approaches to Badger Mouth until they knew every shortcut, every fold deep enough to hide a squadron of horses. The Mongols could mass quietly in the valleys, shielded by the terrain, while the Jin believed their main strength faced the obvious roads. Mountains themselves became the first weapon. The pass funneled all movement into a single, narrow corridor. Lateral movement was almost impossible. Once inside, a force could only go forward or back. For the Jin, this seemed to guarantee that no enemy could outflank them. But Genghis Khan saw another possibility. The same terrain that protected the defenders would also prevent them from reacting quickly if the Mongols struck at an unexpected point. The Mongol plan would depend on speed, surprise, and the ability to concentrate force at one fragile seam in the defensive line. With the ground mapped and the enemy's confidence growing, the stage was set for a move that would overturn every expectation. Macaulay's riders waited in the folds above Badger Mouth, silent but ready. The Jin defenders had packed the pass with men and banners, their commanders certain the Mongols would never risk a direct charge. But when the order came, Mongol horns and drums split the morning air, a signal as old as the steppe. In a heartbeat, the shock column surged forward, hooves pounding over loose scree and broken earth. The Jin line, already compressed by the terrain, buckled as Macaulay's horsemen crashed into their flank. At the same instant, Genghis Khan's main body poured through the central gap, turning the narrow corridor into a killing ground. Jin soldiers, trapped by the ridges and the press of their own numbers, tried to form ranks, but found themselves hemmed in on every side. Messages between units vanished into the chaos. Mongol archers, riding at full gallop, loosed volleys that tore through the crowded defenders. Then, as panic spread, the Mongol reserve swept down from the high ground, striking the rear and cutting off any hope of withdrawal. The Jin force, once so confident behind its walls and fortresses, collapsed into confusion. The pass became a funnel, channeling men not to safety, but to annihilation. No single moment decided the battle. Instead, it was the synchronized violence of movement. The sudden appearance of mounted warriors where none had been seen. The sense that every escape had been foreclosed before the Jin even realized they were in danger. Macaulay's attack from the hills, combined with the frontal shock and the closing of the rear, left the defenders nowhere to run. What began as a defensive stand dissolved into a rout. By midday, Mongol banners flew above the ridge, and the road to Zhengdu lay open. The pattern established here, multi-axis assault, perfect timing, and the ruthless use of terrain, would echo in Mongol campaigns for years to come. Subutai and Jebe set the tempo from the first day, pulling the coalition army ever deeper onto the open steppe. What looked like a panicked retreat was a calculated rhythm. Mongol rearguards would skirmish just long enough to draw the lead Russian and Kipchak detachments forward, then vanish, leaving horses' tracks and abandoned baggage as bait. Each morning, the coalition found the Mongols already gone, their dust clouds receding toward the horizon. The pursuers pushed on, driven by pride and the promise of an easy victory, but every mile cost them more. The Mongols managed their operational pace with discipline. Each warrior had several remounts, switching horses to keep them fresh, while the coalition's animals flagged and thinned. The steppe offered grass and water for the Mongols, who knew every well and grazing patch along the road. For the coalition, unfamiliar with the land and forced to move as a single unwieldy mass, forage ran short. Horses stumbled and slowed, their riders cursing the endless plain. Supply wagons lagged behind, and the coalition's own messengers struggled to keep pace, reports arriving hours or even days late. The longer the pursuit stretched, the more the coalition's command structure frayed. Princes argued over who should lead the chase, each eager for glory but unwilling to yield precedence. Orders grew confused, with some units surging ahead while others fell behind. The Mongols exploited every gap, letting the vanguard outpace the main body, always just out of reach, always promising that one more hard ride would bring the enemy to bay. Jebe, overseeing the rearguard, orchestrated these maneuvers with precision. His men staged minor stands, sometimes leaving behind wounded or spent horses to sell the illusion of exhaustion. Scouts doubled back to report on the coalition's progress, ensuring the Mongol main force kept just enough distance to maintain the chase, but never so much that the enemy would give up. By the time the coalition neared the Khalkha, their horses were gaunt, their men hungry, and their lines stretched across miles of steppe. Supplies dwindled, tempers flared, and the certainty of victory gave way to frustration. The Mongols, meanwhile, preserved their strength, waiting for the exact moment when the enemy's cohesion would snap. The endless pursuit was not a flight, but a slow tightening of the noose. Dust hung low above the Khalkha as the coalition vanguard, worn thin by days of relentless pursuit, finally drew within reach of the retreating Mongols. The Rus princes, desperate to seize what looked like a fleeing enemy, pressed their battered horses forward without waiting for the rest of their columns to close up. Subutai watched from the saddle, reading the scattered lines of the coalition as they straggled toward the river, their discipline broken by exhaustion and impatience. At the moment the vanguard splashed across the shallows, a sharp blast from the Mongol horns cut through the morning air. Banners whipped up along the ridgeline, prearranged signals that snapped every Mongol unit into motion. The feigned retreat ended in an instant. The horse archers who had been falling back now wheeled as one, forming up in disciplined ranks and unleashing a storm of arrows into the advancing Rus and Kipchaks. From both wings, fresh Mongol squadrons surged forward at the signal, closing in on the coalition's exposed flanks. The coalition's lead units, believing they had the enemy cornered, suddenly found themselves hemmed in by cavalry charging from both sides. Panic rippled down the line. The rear, still tangled on the far side of the river, could only watch as the vanguard was enveloped. Subutai's control was absolute. His riders closed the jaws with ruthless precision, cutting off any hope of retreat to the riverbank or regrouping with the main body. Mongol archers circled the trapped coalition, loosing arrows at point-blank range, while heavy cavalry smashed into clusters of isolated men. The coalition's command structure, already frayed by rivalry and exhaustion, collapsed entirely. Princes shouted orders that vanished in the chaos. Some tried to rally their men in tight knots. Others broke away in a frantic bid for escape, only to be hunted down by Mongol detachments waiting beyond the flanks. Within hours, the coalition's vanguard was shattered. The survivors tried to flee back across the river, but Mongol horsemen harried them every step, driving hundreds into the mud and water. By midday, bodies littered both banks. The main Rus contingent, arriving too late to intervene, could only watch as the steppes swallowed their allies. The Khalkha had become a graveyard, and Subutai's calculated reversal, timed to the signals of horn and banner, had turned a drawn-out pursuit into a sudden, merciless collapse. Night on the steppe brought no rest for Subutai's men. While the coalition army stumbled into makeshift camps, Mongol scouts fanned out in every direction, riding hard under a moonless sky. Their task was simple but vital. Find every stream, every patch of grass, every shallow crossing along the Khalkha. Riders moved in silence, pausing only to listen for distant hoofbeats or the snap of a cumin campfire. Each observation, how deep the water ran, where the banks sloped gently, how soft the ground felt underfoot, was committed to memory and relayed back along the Yam, the Mongol courier network. Messages changed hands at a gallop, passing from one fresh horse to the next, until the intelligence reached Subutai and Jebi before dawn. The Mongol columns did not mass in a single place. Instead, they moved in loose formation, each squadron following its own route, grazing its horses and blending into the folds of the land. This dispersal made the army nearly invisible and impossible to encircle. It also meant that, when the time came, they could concentrate at a chosen point with terrifying speed. Subutai's lieutenants understood the rhythm. Ride quietly through the night, avoid unnecessary fires, keep the horses ready, and wait for the signal to converge. Every movement was calculated. The coalition, believing the Mongols were in flight, pressed onward in a long, straggling line. Subutai's scouts counted their numbers, noted the gaps between vanguards and main body, and reported on the condition of enemy horses and wagons. They watched for signs of fatigue, slower pace, abandoned gear, arguments among the princes. Each report added to a growing picture of an enemy stretched thin and losing cohesion. As the sun began to rise, Mongol columns shifted again, closing the distance between their scattered positions. Couriers rode ahead with final instructions. Horns and banners prepped for the moment when the feigned retreat would end. The Mongols had not simply run, they had set the board, shaped the enemy's march, and positioned themselves for a blow that would fall all at once. The patience of the night gave way to a silent, coordinated advance, every rider knowing exactly where to be when the trap closed. The Khalkha River became a trap the moment Subutai's banners snapped overhead. On the far bank, the coalition vanguard, already scattered by exhaustion, watched Mongol horsemen wheel into formation with uncanny discipline. Horns cut through the chaos, one sharp blast, then another, each signal unleashing a new axis of attack. From the north and south, squadrons that had shadowed the chase now surged forward in synchronized waves. The coalition's lead units, still tangled in the shallows, suddenly found Mongol riders closing from both flanks, while a third mass pressed from the front. Panic set in as the jaws of the trap snapped shut. Rus and Kipchak warriors tried to rally, but command had already broken down. Orders vanished in the din. Some princes tried to form a defensive ring. Others shouted for retreat, but the river behind offered no escape. Mongol archers circled at range, loosing arrows with methodical precision, while heavy cavalry crashed through any knot of resistance. Every movement was choreographed, the result of days of planning, careful signaling, and the silent relay of messengers across the steppe. Within the first hour, escape routes vanished. The coalition's main body, still strung out along the riverbank, could only watch as their vanguard was cut to pieces. Any attempt to reinforce turned into slaughter. The Mongols pressed in, compressing the enemy into a shrinking pocket, their lines tightening with each signal. The geometry of the field left no room for maneuver. Every effort to break out was met by a fresh wave of riders, each responding to a banner or a horn blast in perfect time. The killing became relentless, not frenzied. A calculated, professional annihilation. In the heart of the melee, Subutai rode with his officers, eyes fixed on the rhythm of the battle. He gave the order to hold fire as a group of Rus nobles tried to surrender, a gesture of respect rare in steppe warfare and remembered by chroniclers. But there would be no reprieve for most. By midday, the field was silence except for the wind. The coalition army, lured, stretched, and then crushed in a three-way compression, ceased to exist as a fighting force. The lesson of Khalkha would echo for centuries. Perfect timing, perfect coordination, and no escape once the trap closed. Deception, mobility, concentration. These are the three words that unlock the Mongol way of war. Genghis Khan and his commanders never relied on a single trick or stroke of luck. Instead, they built a system where every movement, no matter how small, served a larger plan. Deception was more than a battlefield ruse. It was a mindset. Mongol scouts mapped enemy routines, identified weak points, and masked their own intentions with false retreats, sudden withdrawals, and feints. The enemy saw chaos or panic, but behind the curtain, every gesture was coordinated. Mobility meant more than speed. Each warrior kept several remounts, enabling the army to travel farther and faster than any rival. They could vanish into the folds of the steppe or mountains, only to reappear where least expected. Their messenger relay system, the YM, let orders and intelligence flow across hundreds of miles, synchronizing columns that might never see each other until the decisive hour. Concentration of force was the art of bringing overwhelming power to a single point. Whether piercing a narrow pass, encircling a scattered column, or pressing an enemy against a riverbank, the Mongols chose their moment and location. They struck not where the enemy was strongest, but where he was least prepared, massing their best troops for the critical blow. These principles, deception, mobility, concentration, form a toolkit that has shaped military doctrine for centuries. Modern military doctrine still draws from the Mongol playbook. NATO field manuals reference the value of rapid maneuver, deep penetration, and operational surprise. Principles Genghis Khan's cavalry put into practice centuries before tanks or helicopters. The United States Army's air-land battle concept, developed in the late Cold War, echoes Mongol operational art. Attack across the entire depth of the enemy's system, not just the front line. Deep operations, flexible columns, and the ability to mass force at critical points. These are lessons Mongol commanders mastered on horseback, and they remain central to mechanized and rapid reaction forces today. Lieutenant General John Allen once described modern mobile warfare as an attempt to match the tempo and unpredictability of Mongol campaigns. The challenge for today's planners isn't just speed, but synchronizing dispersed units to strike as one, an art the Mongols perfected with flags, horns, and a culture of drilled discipline. Their legacy lives on in every doctrine that values agility, deception, and decisive concentration. Today, military academies on every continent still dissect Mongol tactics, not for nostalgia, but because rapid adaptation, deception, and psychological warfare decide conflicts now as they did then. As warfare turns ever more unpredictable, Genghis Khan's lessons echo louder. No fortress is truly safe, and no doctrine immune to innovation. The edge belongs to those who learn, unlearn, and strike before they're understood. Thanks for watching. What modern commander do you want to see next?